Is it wrong for Christians to appeal to the supernatural when doing science? And as we're doing science, how and where and when should we appeal to the supernatural? My name's Steve Schramm. I am the host here of the Winsome Creationist, and I'm excited to share some thoughts with you on a topic that I don't think as creationists, we talk often enough about, especially popularly. There's a little bit of academic discussion about this, but even tends to be in the realm of specific scientific models we're discussing rather than at a high level. So I'm very interested in creation science research. We've got a brand new project launching very soon that I can't wait to tell you about. I'm like this close from being able to tell you about it, dealing with creation science research. And so one of the big questions as we are going into this endeavor and doing more research, and this is one of the things that we have to think about. At what point does the fact that we live in a supernaturally created world come into play when we're doing science? If you're watching on YouTube, we're going to pop over to Excalibur here. And I've got two words on the screen. One is a problem and the other being opportunity. And as someone who is thinking about the study of God's creation, we do have what you might see as two sides of the same coin in a problem and an opportunity, which is that creationists believe fundamentally that the world was supernaturally created by God. But fundamentally, science is the study of the natural world. And so how does that interplay work together? Let's talk about some examples. What are some examples that we could point to illustrate this tension? There's one very obvious one, and that would be the resurrection, right? The resurrection is a problem in a sense because it is supernatural, but it's an opportunity because it is the central claim of Christianity, right? If the resurrection happened, then Jesus is God, and you can point to that event as the hinge of history. It's the most important event that's ever happened, and what you do with Jesus is the most important question that you can answer. In fact, the very fact that it is supernatural is what makes it so special and so powerful. But if you think about it, the resurrection is actually downstream from something else. And that something else is creation, right? So creation is actually upstream from the resurrection. If creation happened, then the resurrection is fundamentally possible, okay? But people don't rise from the dead. So in Christianity, that's the point. And yet you can't have that kind of thing happen. You can't have a resurrection happen without a supernaturally created world. And yet creation science, the fundamental tension here is that we're doing science, which is the study of the natural world. What an interesting concept. What are some other examples? Another one is in the issue of distant starlight. Distant starlight, okay? Now this is an issue, I can't spell today. This is an issue that has been of interest to creationists for a very long time. And one of the areas where we do not have even scientific consensus among our own ranks. There are lots of different theories floating out there about how light from distant stars could reach the Earth in an acceptable time period for creation, right? Actually, day 4 of creation, so that Adam could see the starlight. And so we have to figure out how this happens, because if we look at the distances that are involved converted to a measure of time using naturalistic assumptions, then we have a great deal more time than the roughly 6,000 to 7,000 years that most creationists believe the Earth and universe are. And one of the popular solutions, or at least thought ways of thinking about this issue, is what Danny Faulkner calls the Dasha theory. Okay, Dasha is the Hebrew word for bring forth. It's the word used in the creation account when it says the earth, God commanded the earth to bring forth the fruit, bring forth the herbs and the fruit bearing trees and all of those things, right? It's that word. And Danny has proposed a solution that he claims is not necessarily scientifically satisfying, but you could think of the mechanism being one that supernaturally draws out, essentially, the light from those stars. And the light from those stars reaches the earth in the same sort of rapid manner as perhaps trees would have rapidly grown during creation week. And that's a fundamentally supernatural thing. Now, Dr. Phil Dennis, who's been on the channel a few times now, he suggested that his theory of distant starlight could potentially provide a physical mechanism for this. But this all remains to be seen. So again, a fundamental question that we have to ask ourselves as creationists is how much supernaturalism is involved in our answer to these questions. I have another couple examples. Another one is the flood. The flood. And I'm going to say specifically here, the heat problem. All right? The heat problem. We do have a consensus creation model, it's fair to say, for the mechanism that caused the flood. That's not to say that there's not other theories. Walt Brown's hydroplate theory is a very common one, but by far, in a way, the consensus theory among credentialed creation researchers with regards to the flood is called catastrophic plate tectonics, and it's very similar to the sort of slow-moving naturalistic plate tectonics theories that are accepted by most scientists today, with the exception that this would have happened during the flood year and been very rapidly accelerated, meters per second instead of inches per year sort of movement over a short period of time. However, there's a big problem with that, and the big problem being this heat issue. Okay, there is too much heat generated by the radioactive processes involved in this process, in this current model, the way that it is articulated today. And as of yet, and creationists have been thinking about this problem for more than 20 years now, as of today, there is no real solution to this issue. No naturalistically known solution to this issue. And that's interesting, right? We need to do more research. We need more funding. We need to spend more time, do more research, trying to figure out like what kind of physical mechanism, if any, would have removed the heat during this radioactive process. And yet, some creationists are comfortable with, and maybe could be comfortable with, I don't know, and maybe even should be comfortable with, a supernatural removal of the heat, right? The heat dissipated supernaturally, the flood being a supernatural thing. And so there's this tension of like, how much do we lean on the hard science, the observable data, the facts in front of us, versus being able to inject a supernatural cause? This is one of the areas where I don't think mainstream science gives creationists enough credit. Everybody talks about the God of the gaps thing, and creation science is not fundamentally a God of the gaps sort of argument. It's also a big misnomer, a misunderstanding that many people have of creation scientists, where they claim that we're cheating or not doing real science because the Bible tells us what to conclude. The truth of the matter is that the Bible just gives us guidelines, okay? It gives us guardrails. We'll come over here for a little bit and maybe do a little bit of a drawing here. It gives us guardrails to stay within, right? And all science is ultimately philosophical. If I were to draw this out for you without telling you immediately that I was talking about creation science, I could start this by saying, look, all science has guardrails, right? And the guardrails look like this. In the middle, we could say natural causes, right? And then on the outside of these guardrails is where we would say, just duplicate this and bring it over, is where we would say supernatural causes. I'll put it over here too, right? So many would say that true science is only possible to do within the boundaries of these guardrails, okay? And that anything outside of this goes to supernatural causes. The resurrection is actually one of those areas where this conversation happens a lot, because Bart Ehrman has famously made a comment that no matter how persuasive he might find the historical data that points to the resurrection, because he's a historian, he is not allowed to conclude anything supernatural, okay? And that brings us to a big problem, which is the articulation between three different things. And I'm going to return to this illustration of natural versus supernatural causes in a moment. But it really comes down to three things. Number one, philosophical naturalism. Number two, methodological naturalism. And I don't even know if this is the official term for it, but what I'm going to call supernaturalism. Okay. Philosophical naturalism is the idea that says that science essentially declares that there is no God, right? That you can use science to get to the bottom of everything. You don't need God to explain anything. Methodological naturalism doesn't really make a claim about whether or not God could be involved, religious belief could be involved in some things, but says as long as we're going to study the natural world, the only causes that can be admitted are those which are considered natural. And supernaturalism essentially says that theoretically a cause for any given phenomena could be, in principle, supernatural. Okay. And I think you could actually expand this. You could actually say that there is a philosophical supernaturalism and a methodological one as well. I think you could say that. What would that look like? A philosophical supernaturalism would say that God must be invoked, right? This would be like the way that the ancients used to think about God and science, which is that divine activity could theoretically be detected directly in the way that the universe was held together. Indeed, the Bible does speak to this, that God is holding all things together, and I believe there is a sense in which he's doing that. I believe that many of the natural laws that we have discovered are a way of thinking about how God is upholding the universe, the very existence of these natural laws. A lot of people want to say that they're the base fundamental thing, but it's really hard to get these natural laws without a God having had created them. And there's a lot more nuance that we could go into there. Theoretically, though, methodological supernaturalism would say something like this: a natural cause should be investigated and exhausted until such a time as when no natural cause seems plausible, in which case a supernatural cause could be considered. And I really think that more creationists should be open to thinking this way. Many creationists tend to think mostly like this: methodological naturalism. While I think there is a sort of merit to that, I think at the end of the day, we mustn't ignore that our worldview is fundamentally supernatural, and it may not be as scientifically satisfying, but the appeal to a supernatural cause at least needs to be permissible in our models. I definitely think it should be rare in our models because God built the natural world and theoretically we can discover how it works, but we should be very careful not to find ourselves in this methodological naturalism position. So if I could just illustrate it, I would say we should probably have something like this, right? We should probably say that this is the wrong direction to go, and that this is probably the way that we should be going more often, right? We should be going more towards opening up our minds to methodological supernaturalism rather than methodological naturalism. And as it relates to science anyway, I'm just not entirely sure that these two are useful heuristics. Philosophical naturalism and philosophical supernaturalism. They're not really good heuristics or ways of thinking about it. Even though we, of course, believe in philosophical naturalism as it relates to studying the scientific world, that might not should be our initial posture, because we do really believe that God built this world, built this universe, initiated the laws, gave us science essentially as a gift to be able to study the natural world. All right, so let's go back to these guardrails real quick. Again, what we're trying to say here is that a lot of times these guardrails are put in place by naturalists, right? To say supernatural causes are not permissible, only natural causes are. I wanted to make the point that naturalists do this, so that when I make the point that we do this as well, lessons to blow a little bit, because we do this as well. And here's how we do this. We say that we make a distinction between what can be known what can be known biblically and the things that simply can't be known biblically. Okay? Oops. There are some things that we just can't know biblically. And our guardrails look like that. There are some things that we can know biblically, some things that we can't know biblically. And with the things that we can't know biblically, these are green lights, right? We have free reign over here. If it can't be known biblically, then we are free to hypothesize around it, to theorize around it, to build models, and to try to understand it. Okay? What's a really good example of this? One really good example of something that can't be known biblically would be what mechanism caused the fountains of the great deep to burst open. Okay. And in fact, I'm going to reword it. What physical mechanism caused the fountains of the great deep to burst open? We can't know that biblically. We just can't. So we could come up with hypotheses. We can look at that, okay, and say, is there something that physically caused the fountains of the great deep to burst open, or did God just simply say it was going to happen and it happened? Well, that's possible. We don't have biblical evidence that's exactly how it went down. It's plausible that there actually is a physical mechanism, and so we should be interested in knowing and learning to the extent possible what those things are, okay? And what can we know biblically about this? Here's what we can know biblically. The fountains of the great deep burst open. That is something that we can know biblically. And I'm putting known biblically if you're watching in red. The reason why I did that is because that is a legitimate guardrail, okay, that we cannot go outside of. The Bible commits us to this sentence, which is the fountains of the great deep burst open, because it says as much. And we get to do the hard work of figuring out why. And our understanding of that is just not always going to be perfect. And it may lead to these weird, uncomfortable conclusions sometimes. Okay, we've got this heat problem. We've got this heat problem over here that is unresolved and very much related to this conversation about the fountains of the great deep bursting open. Somewhere in that whole process of events that followed from that event happening, we now have this heat problem. And the question is, do we go to a supernatural solution for this to figure it out because we spent 20, 25 years trying to figure out what this is and we can't seem to do it? Or do we finally say, you know what, for the time being, I'm going to lean with a supernatural solution for this and try to figure it out. Now, there is a case to be made for, this is a 4-letter word in some circles, but we're going to write it down here because it's really a 5-letter word, faith. Okay, there's a case to be made for faith. Faith is a very important aspect of what we believe and do. There's a great video on YouTube that you can find. It's Kurt Wise. I'm going to write it down here so you can find it later. Kurt Wise. It's at Truett McConnell, where he teaches. Truett McConnell University. I don't know how to spell that. McConnell, something like that. University. And he's talking about his floating forest theory. And the brief story there is that he was very taken, Kurt Wise was, by the evolutionary evidence for the fossil order of plants that could be found in the record. And he found himself a committed creationist who was quite taken and really saw the merits in the evolutionary progression that was available to find there. And for years, this problem plagued him, but he felt sure that one day God would provide an answer for him. And that happened. And he thought about, I forget if he said he was on a trip or something, but something jogged his memory about this. And he remembered this concept of a quaking bog, and ultimately came to the conclusion that there was very likely in the pre-flood world a large, maybe continent-sized floating forest, maybe multiple of these, where you would find certain kinds of vegetation and also animals like fishopods and things of that nature, and certain amphibious animals that not only would match the evolutionary explanation, but even provide better answers in many different areas. For example, the origin of coal could possibly be helpfully explained more. There's a whole list of things that he gives. And when you're doing creation science, you have to understand that, like with any kind of science, you may not have the answer right away. And so you don't want to prematurely insert a supernatural explanation where a natural explanation is possible, but you do all that while staying within the guidelines, within the guardrails of what can be known biblically. Kurt never had to question whether or not there was a global flood, whether or not that the evolutionary order of plants as it was presented could be fit into and reinterpreted and understood within a creation framework. He had faith that would happen, stayed within the guardrails, and then ultimately found a solution that proved more satisfying than the evolutionary one that he had found so satisfying before. So, yes, this is absolutely possible to do. It is 100% possible to find natural explanation for things. And sometimes we look at what could be a possible supernatural explanation as well. And we at least consider whether it's a possibility in this case and whether we need it. I do want to say one more thing about this, which is the creation week. It's another one of these examples in general, which we talked about a little bit with distant starlight. But the creation week is another one of these places where it seems very possible that some sort of supernatural growth mechanism did happen. Sometimes, unfortunately, William Lane Craig talks about this as being like sort of a way to make fun of creationists because, it's like they believe in like something that might have happened, something like time-lapse photography. I'm fine with that. God created this world supernaturally. Creation was fundamentally a supernatural act. Because what Craig and some others have done is they've biased towards methodological naturalism in their investigation of science. And what they've done is they've followed that evidence where it leads without, in my view, the consideration of these guardrails. They haven't stayed within the biblically knowable guardrails that relate to the age of the earth discussion. And I think that is the fundamental issue that we're fighting. And as creationists, we need to consider more. And I'd love to see more people write about and talk about and make videos about and think about a sort of philosophical framework for the study of God's natural world through creation science. So that's what I have for you this week. Coming up soon, I'm going to do a review, speaking of William Lane Craig, a look at the interplay. There was a Lutheran Satire video recently that was done talking about William Lane Craig and young earth creationism, and he responded to that, and I have some thoughts about that I'd like to share with you, but I'm gonna save that for our next episode together. So I hope this was maybe a helpful way to start thinking about the question of how much supernaturalism is allowed. And another one of these blue sky episodes, maybe you don't like it when I think out loud like this, but this is a thing that is worth thinking about and getting right from a creationist perspective. And I think it's worth talking about and sharing with you. Hope you guys found this useful. I will be back with you shortly, and y'all take care.